So at this point, you guys have been able to create web applications. Most of the work having been done on the server, basically using a templating engine on the server to generate the HTML that we wanted to generate. The browser obviously has come into play in the sense that the browser is what's rendering our page. We're using the browser is using the combination of our CSS file and our DOM that ends up getting generated to style the page. So there has been some work that's been going on in the browser, but it's been fairly minimal, meaning that the browser itself, and this is why, when you do Trip Planner, the first part of this is the static version of Trip Planner. We could sort of think even all the applications that we've done up to this point have been static in the sense that there's very little manipulation that's happening on the client. And that's going to change as we start looking at using more of JavaScript on the client to manipulate what the user is looking at. So a couple of terms here. When we think about the document object model, and we spoke about this a little bit when we ended up looking at when we were looking at CSS, right? This is the browser's representation of the HTML. This really is going to end up looking like a tree. It's going to look like a upside down tree where we've got this HTML node and we've got a head node and we've got a body node beneath that. Within the body node, we could have an unordered list with a collection of list items. But the real distinction that we're going to make is what's happening client side as opposed to server side. So you don't have this issue with other platforms because the only way that, if you were developing in something like Ruby on Rails, or you were developing in .NET, you wouldn't be writing any JavaScript for the server side. But when you are using the JavaScript stack and you're using Node as your backend, you are writing JavaScript, but that's JavaScript that's being executed within the context of the server, right? That's Node that's being used to execute your JavaScript. So here we're going to make the distinction of JavaScript that you've been writing on the server side, things like our routing and our models and that sort of thing, and JavaScript which we're going to write on the client side, and this we haven't really done at all at this point. So when we end up thinking about front-end applications, what we're really building is we're building user interfaces. And the reason why we want to be able to execute JavaScript on the front end is because that's really the only game in town for interactivity within the browser. That's the only language that browsers end up understanding. And if we want to have a web application that feels more like an application where you have the interactivity and the user interfaces, right, we're going to need some language to do that, and that language is going to end up being JavaScript. So what we're really going to end up doing is we're going to end up manipulating the DOM, and we're going to do this based on events and interactivity. So a couple of different examples that you could think about. You could think about things like, when we were looking at when we were looking at our WikiStack example, where maybe we ended up adding tags to a page. Well, we could think about possibly, maybe we would want to remove a tag from a page, and we'd click on that tag, and that tag would end up disappearing. And maybe we don't want to have a full page reload when that happens, but basically we would be manipulating the DOM. When the user ended up clicking on the tag, we would have that tag disappear. But probably even a better example of this is, let's say that you built some application and we wanted to go back up to the server from time to time. Maybe they were following stock prices, and we wanted to show in real time those changes in stock prices. So granted, now we can end up doing something like this with WebSockets. Let's say that we just wanted to do it by periodically polling the server to see if our stock prices changed. If those stock prices ended up changing, we would want to let the user know who's looking at this page, and we could do that by manipulating the DOM. So sometimes the events are user-initiated events, but they could also be events that are sort of happening in the background. You see this with Gmail when you have a new some changes that are happening when someone ends up sending you a new email, right? You don't have to refresh your page; you see it automatically. So that's an event that's happening. The browser ends up getting wind of it, and the browser ends up changing the DOM. So we're going to be talking about jQuery, not to be confused with jQuery, which is some cartoon. And what we're going to be talking about first is let's just talk about how sort of the normal flow of events in an application. So let's say this is denoting a server somewhere, and let's say it's a server somewhere in Norway or something like that. And let's say that we make a GET request to that server. So on that server, here we have our JavaScript, which is written, and this is being executed on the server, where we're going to return this index.html file. So this file goes over the wire through HTTP, comes down to the client. What happens at that point is that this page ends up getting read, parsed by the browser, and the browser goes through, and as it goes through, if it sees other requests, it'll end up making those other requests. And if it ends up seeing a request for in a script tag, it'll make that request for a JavaScript file. Again, with our applications up to this point, we really haven't done too much of this. We've done style sheets, but we haven't done really much of anything with client-side JavaScript. So again, I mean, on the server side, we'll end up writing some code where we have some static route where we end up returning this file, and this JS file will go back to the client. Now, the thing that is a little bit more complicated here is that, again, this JavaScript file is being served to the browser, right? It's up there on the server, and we're sending it down to the browser. And this code is not going to end up executing on the server. The server is going to return that file through a static route, but it's going to end up executing on the client. And the thing that ends up making that complicated is that we've got all these clients. We've got one server, and we've got all these clients that are sitting around here. And the problem is that the browsers are not exactly the same. First of all, people are using different browsers. They're using different versions of browsers. They're looking at different devices. And so when you're dealing with the server, you have control over the server. When you're dealing with the clients, you don't, because you don't know exactly what browser they're going to use. You could sniff some of these things out, but there's a lot of different browsers they could use, or there's several different browsers, many different versions, and many different devices. So, as an example of this, depending on how your browser's implementation of JavaScript looks, there could be different ways to doing the same thing. So, as an example, if you wanted to get the classes of an element, right, in modern browsers, there's a method called getComputedStyle, where in older browsers, you might have something like currentStyle, and other browsers, you might end up doing things differently. And maybe you'd actually even have to get this class as an attribute and parse it. The bottom line is that things are not. You can't always write the same JavaScript code and get the exact same result using different browsers, because again, their implementation of JavaScript can be different. Again, there's following this spec of ECMAScript, but again, it's not exact. These are different pieces of software that are running, and they'll end up behaving differently. So, again, the big issue is that you really don't have control over these things. Here's an example of something you don't see this quite as much anymore. One of the reasons why you don't see it is because jQuery is around. But one of the things that you used to have before jQuery came into existence is that literally you would end up getting a DOM element, and you would sort of sniff out what the DOM element had defined. And based upon what the DOM element had defined, you sort of knew what path to go down. And so, I mean, when you ended up doing this sniffing, you looked at the if and the else if. Maybe one type of browser would have something called get computed style. Another type of browser might have something called current style. Yet another one might have runtime style. And again, you would have basically all these if else's to deal with it. And you ran into an issue too, because all of a sudden, if someone decided to start using another browser, you'd have to go in and you'd have to, add another else if to get this to work. And it really made writing JavaScript difficult, because what would end up happening is that you'd end up building an application. And you'd look at it on your, maybe if you were a developer, you were developing with, again, I'm sort of dating myself here, but maybe you'd be, using IE, and then you'd end up going to show it to somebody else, and not even that this is supported anymore, but maybe they're using a Mac and you're showing it to them on IE on the Mac, and it would work, totally different. It would just basically bomb out. And this was a real problem that you ran into. Actually, the same browser on different devices would behave differently. And then you ran into problems where, someone would decide to go look at this thing in Netscape, and it would look, nothing would end up rendering because there was a JavaScript error and things would be, totally screwed up. So, what it ends up coming down to are the things that browsers do differently. Now, this is not quite the case anymore, but the fact is that they do things differently, and they did quite a bit more, a number of years back, and that became, how jQuery ended up getting introduced. So a big part of what you're going to be looking at with jQuery is how to even find the elements that you're looking for, because very often, you're going to want to wire up elements, specifying, hey, look, if this gets clicked on, do this, if this gets clicked on, do that, and that sort of thing. In order to do that, you have to be able to select the elements that you're looking for. You're going to want to modify what someone is looking at, and the way that that's often done is by setting styles or removing to styles, removing classes to elements is going to determine what the user ends up seeing. So again, that's what really is giving them this user experience. That's what's making the browser a user interface. So, and the other thing is that different browsers actually have what would be called different APIs in terms of, what is actually supported by different browsers. So there's a lot of newer APIs that are out there, but things like, local storage or Canvas or that sort of thing. Again, those things might not be standardized across browsers. So the bottom line is really what it ends up coming down to. You want to take this this differential of the browser out of your take it off your plate as a development task. You don't want to be in a position to say, okay, I'm going to get this application working in Internet Explorer, and maybe the person next to me is going to get it working in Firefox, and someone else is going to have to do it in Chrome, or you want to be able to not have to deal with those differences, and that's where jQuery ends up coming in. So this is just a very simple example of jQuery, where the one sort of ubiquitous thing you're going to see when we end up looking at jQuery is the $sign. And once you end up bringing jQuery in as a script, you're going to have this $sign. And just to sort of give you a quick demo into this, let's just take a look at something. So I've got a JS bin up here. So here's a kind of a simple example, but let's take a look at the one. Let me actually log in here. So it'll recognize who I am. Now, the only thing that I've done here is I've brought in jQuery as a library. jQuery, I've brought in 3.1. A couple of things that I think is kind of important. First of all, I've specified a console.log of $sign. And one thing I want to show you is that $sign is actually the same as the global variable for jQuery. Let me actually do my standard console.clear. Okay. So here's my jQuery, and just to sort of show you this, jQuery, if I say, is jQuery the same as $sign? It'll tell me true. So that these are basically pointing to the same object. And so the dollar sign is sort of my entree into jQuery. In fact, it is jQuery. So if I was to go here, just to sort of take this example over here, and I'm going to put a CSS class in here, and I'm going to say red, and I'll say color is going to be okay. And I was to go over here, and let me go and I'm going to use a jQuery selector. And this is what we're going to be sort of looking at in these slides. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my H1. So here what I'm doing is I'm using, instead of using get element by tag name or get element by ID, I have the ability to end up doing a selector with jQuery. And one of the things that I could do is once I end up doing this, if I wanted to remove this H1, I could remove it. You've seen now actually it's gone away. I don't want to remove it, so let me actually, instead of doing that, let me add my class of red. And so what I'm doing here is I'm basically manipulating the DOM with jQuery. So the dollar sign is being used as a selector. And we'll look at a couple of different examples of this, but just, the same way that if you understand CSS selectors, then you'll understand jQuery selectors. So I'm going to go over here, and within my H1, I'll put a span. And let me just give myself a little room to work here so you can see this. And within this span, I'm going to put in the text foo. So again, H1 add class red, but instead of actually saying H1 here, I'm going to give myself a little room. I'm going to say H1, and I'm going to say span. So the same way that you can have a selector, and this is basically, if we were using CSS selectors, this would be, we know that the space means span underneath H1, and in fact, we'll do that, and we'll end up adding the class of red. So a very, very key thing that we're going to end up seeing here with these selectors is that when I end up using this dollar sign H1 span, what I end up getting back, the way that I always like to describe this, and just to sort of be a little bit more clear about this, I'm going to take this and I'm going to copy it. And notice it does it to both of these. So what I want you to realize here is that when I use this selector, and I could put this in a variable if I want to. I could go over here and say, hey, look, my spans, and I'm going to use my selector, and I'm going to say H1 span. And instead of putting this here again and using my selectors, I'm going to say use my spans and add class. This works the same way. What I want you to see here, if I ended up doing a console.log of spans, okay, what this is actually going to do, and I said length on this, it's going to tell me I have 2 of these, okay? When you end up thinking about jQuery and you end up using selectors, what you end up getting back is, sure, you've got a collection of DOM objects. How big is that collection? Well, in our case, it's a collection of 2. We've got 2 spans that are underneath H1s. But the point that I want to make here is that it's a jQuery, when you use the dollar sign, what you end up getting back is, I like to call these a wrapped set. And it's a set that you could manipulate. So when I say spans add class, internally, and we'll talk about this, it basically is going to iterate over each of these spans. It's going to end up adding a class to them. If I was to go and start investigating, it's a little bit harder to do here with JSBin, but if I was to start inspecting this, I would see that here's my class of red that dynamically is getting added to the DOM. So when you think of the dollar sign, again, it's a wrapped set. And one way that I could sort of show you exactly what this means is that I'm going to show you something that you might think would error out, but it won't end up error out. It won't end up erroring out. If I was to say, hey, foos equals dollar sign foo. Now what I'm looking for is I'm looking for tags, right? Because again, this is assuming that there's some type of tag called foo. Now, there is no type of tag called foo. If I was to say console.log foo's.length, again, this is going to wrap around DOM elements, but there's no DOM elements to wrap around because there's no DOM elements there. So normally you would think that if you ended up trying to find something and then you called a method on it, like if I said foo's.addClass red, you might think that that would end up resulting in an error. But it doesn't, because again, what jQuery says is, okay, there's some wrapped set. Again, it could be a wrapped set of 0 elements, in which case, when it goes to iterate over those elements and attempts to add a class to them, nothing will happen because there will be nothing to iterate over. But it doesn't throw an exception. So sometimes I think what happens is that people write code with jQuery and they see nothing is working, but they see no error messages, and usually that's a result of that they haven't ended up writing their selectors correctly. So just to sort of just show you what I mean here, let's say that I really had made a mistake. What I wanted to do was I really meant the class foo. I was looking for all the elements that had a class of foo, and I kind of screwed up with my selector. Again, I don't see anything happening. I don't see any errors here, and I see that my color is not being changed on XYZ. But if I do this and I change this to .foo, and now my selector is looking for the class as opposed to the tag, this ends up working. So it's just something that you have to be aware of when you're using selectors. Again, if you understand how CSS selectors work, you're a big chunk of the way home in understanding how a jQuery selectors work. So let's just head back to these slides. So again, we've seen this jQuery collection. Very, very important that, again, this could be, when we use the $, it's wrapping around, it's going to end up finding any DOM elements that end up matching this criteria. If it doesn't find any, it doesn't throw an error. It just gives you back a wrapped set with 0 elements inside of it. So jQuery provides this abstraction for going and manipulating the DOM. When did this really come from? So this is actually, fairly been around for a while now. It was created by this guy, John Resig, and it changed how people wrote JavaScript because, at this point, when you ended up having jQuery, what it basically did is it normalized. It didn't normalize JavaScript, but it wrapped around JavaScript. So you could call internally jQuery had the code that worried about how different browsers handled JavaScript, how different browsers had different native DOM methods. And jQuery was sort of doing the heavy lifting for you. And you had access to this object and you could just tell it, hey, look, to add a class. Internally, it was calling the correct native JavaScript methods, because in the end, that's what has to be called. I mean, if you are manipulating the DOM, you only can manipulate the DOM through native JavaScript in the end, but it was jQuery that ended up wrapping around it. So, I mean, people sometimes even get confused. They think that jQuery is, in fact, JavaScript, but again, jQuery is wrapping around JavaScript, and it had a big impact on people feeling confident to write applications that were pretty heavy on the client-side JavaScript. So when we look at jQuery, a big chunk of this is looking at selectors. Again, the way that none of these things would do anything off the bat, but what they would be doing would be selecting. So again, here we're selecting all the H1 tags. Here we would be selecting, and I think jQuery, even if you had multiple IDs of my heading, I think it only would give you the first one because the theory is you shouldn't have multiple IDs that are the same. But again, the second one is based on an ID. The third one is based on a class. And the fourth one is based upon any span that's below H1. We ended up looking at that in the demo a couple of minutes ago. So, I mean, basically, you can figure out what you want to do, and jQuery has a way of doing it. So, if you wanted to add an event handler to a button, you could end up doing it by doing a selector for a button. And again, if there were multiple buttons with that same class, this event handler would work on each of those buttons. You'd be adding a separate event handler for each of those buttons. Or what I should say is maybe the event handler would be the same, but it would get executed for any of the buttons that ended up getting clicked on. So on is a method that you can add to a jQuery collection. The $sign gives us a jQuery collection. And again, it's going to iterate over that collection, and it's going to add an event handler to that collection. It's going to attach an on click to each element that is in that collection. So again, there's no real magic to it in the end, that these are native JavaScript methods that end up getting added. So there's a couple of things that you can end up doing here, but some things that get to be a little bit trickier, things like change and key press. And again, jQuery makes it a little bit easier to do some of these things, which would be a little bit trickier to do just using a native DOM method. So one thing to sort of understand a little bit more about how jQuery works is that if we looked at this structure here, where we've got this author profile and we've got an author name, a genre, and maybe some titles of books, what this would look like. So these are, when we end up looking at jQuery, sort of breaks these down into different parts of the library. When we end up looking at children, what this is doing is giving us the ability to traverse the DOM. So again, if we have an author profile, we can get all the children of the author profile. Now granted, there could be multiple author profiles, and in that case, we'd end up getting multiple children collections. But usually when this is used, right, this is used in a way that we're getting some element and we're dealing with the children of this element. Again, underneath the covers, this is looking at probably the child nodes, which are defined in the JavaScript DOM, but jQuery is wrapping around that. So these would be the children, right? These 1, 2, 3 tags would be the children. Now, we could go a step further and we could say, hey, look, we want to be a little more specific, and not just the children, but we want to look at the one with the class of author name. And this would give us this first H1. We could also go in a little bit of a different direction, and we could say, hey, look, we want to go upwards, and we could end up getting the using the selector of genre, and we could say we want to get the parent, and that would end up giving us the parent, which is going to be the author profile. Again, underneath the covers, there's native DOM methods that are doing this, but jQuery is doing the heavy lifting for us. On the same token, if we wanted to get the siblings of genre, jQuery would basically give us everything other than the genre. So it would be the author name, and it would be the titles would be the second sibling. Again, when we end up doing the selectors, and we've seen this before, if we had a class of titles and we had a space and we had an li, what we're saying basically, or what we're asking for, is give me all the list items that are underneath any elements that have a class of titles. So we'd have these 3 list items. And so once you can end up selecting things, so before all we saw was selecting things, we weren't doing anything with them, but we also have the ability to manipulate them. So for instance, if we wanted to change an inline style for these list items, we could specify, hey, first find these list items, and then there is the ability to manipulate. And so certain methods that allow you to manipulate is you could remove things, you could append things, but one of the things you could do is you could change inline styles with the .css method. And this takes an object literal, and you could specify, hey, look, what I want to change is the color, and I want to make all these list items have a color of red. So part of what we spoke about here is there's this implicit looping that ends up going on. When you end up having a jQuery collection and you call a method on it, internally, it's going to end up looping over it. So in our example with the titles, if we wanted to set the width for each of these titles, we could end up using a selector to get all the list items that are underneath the class of titles. And then if we called CSS, it's going to loop over all those elements, and it's going to end up setting the width. There's also methods that we could end up using to get the text. Now, I think with this, what ends up happening here, this is something that we can end up testing out with our demo here, is that what should end up happening here, here we have our spans. So I'm going to here are our spans, and just to see, I'm going to say console.log, and I'll say spans.text. So one thing that happens here with these spans, so all this is doing here is that it's going to take the text, and it basically is going to take the text from this span and combine them together. So here, instead of setting something, we're getting something. If we said HTML, well, the HTML and the text really are kind of the same thing here because we don't have any internal tags here. This is actually a little bit different. When we do the HTML, it doesn't give us both of those. It ends up just giving one of them, which is kind of an interesting thing. So here we've got these spans, H1 span. If we call HTML on it, again, it looks at it and says, all right, I guess you want me to return the HTML. If we wanted to really see that this, if I went over here and I made this a B, right? And I looked at this, here if it says, even though I have a collection of two, it doesn't quite know how to return the HTML, so it just gives me the HTML for the first one. Just to sort of show you this, if I moved and changed the order here, now it's just going to give me the HTML for this first one. So usually when you're accessing properties, it's usually one thing that you're accessing, like HTML or text. But again, if I wanted to modify the HTML, I could end up doing that. So here, if I went over here with my spans, and I said spans HTML, and I said bar, you'd notice that I've taken my two spans, and again, it implicitly looped over them and ended up setting the HTML property to bar. So again, the big takeaway there is this whole idea that you have this implicit looping that's going on, even with text, although we actually saw that with HTML. It doesn't really end up doing implicit looping. It ends up bringing just the first one back, but it's not really something that you're going to have to worry about all that much. So, the other thing that we can, also do is that you have the ability to, when you end up getting something, you can end up getting the children, right, which allows you to sort of manipulate these elements as well. So there's also the idea of the implicit looping and explicit looping. So if you actually wanted to go, and you don't have to do this that often, but if you have this, and again, I'm going to keep on using this term, that this is if we have that $ titles variable. And the way that the reason for sort of naming a variable like that, and someone had asked me this before, is that maybe you're being very specific that this is a jQuery collection. And again, I like to call them jQuery wrapped sets in the sense that they're wrapping around DOM elements, but there are jQuery methods to go and manipulate those DOM elements, right? And just to sort of beat a little bit of a dead horse here, right? If I was to go back to this example here, when we talk about that, if I was to say to my spans.remove, there's two elements, and you see they ended up totally disappearing here. I ended up removing them, and I didn't really want to do that, but that's that whole idea of that explicit looping. Here are the elements. It's a wrapped set, could be wrapped around 0 elements. In my case, it's wrapped around 2, and I've ended up removing those. I mean, you could do some kind of cool things here where I could say I want to hide them. And if I want to hide them, I can actually hide them slowly. So I don't know if you saw that, but if I go to run that, they'll be hidden slowly, and you get the effect of this animation. So that's another thing that sort of jQuery gives you out of the box. So one of the things that you don't have to do, but you have the ability to actually go in and manually, explicitly go over and loop over each item in this collection. The important part here is that when you do end up doing that, what you're doing is when you end up looping over each of those, what you're doing is you're basically looping over a DOM element. So one other thing that we could do here is that if we wanted to wire up all of the buttons that are underneath jukebox, we could go and we can say, look, here's the jukebox, find the button underneath it, and when any of these buttons are clicked on, we want to execute this callback function. So again, we spoke about things being asynchronous. This is an idea of something being asynchronous. And the bottom line is, when does this function end up getting called? Well, if no one ends up clicking on this button, it might never get called, but it will get called if someone ends up clicking on the button. The big thing that I want to show you here is that, when you end up doing this, what is the context inside this callback? And the way that this is written, and this is the way that regular DOM event handlers are set up, is that when you end up wiring up each of these buttons, this is going to be the DOM element that was clicked on. If you want to turn that DOM element into a jQuery object for whatever reason, you want to set the class on it, you can do it. You just have to use the $sign. So the $sign gets used in a couple of different ways. And the way that this ends up getting used is that the $sign is going to be used to find what we're looking for. We could also use the $sign to create elements. And the last thing that I spoke about was using the $sign if you have a DOM element and you want to convert it to a jQuery object. And again, I don't call them objects. I call these, jQuery wrapped sets. So for instance, we could use a $sign to find something. And we could also use the $sign to create something. So when we do this, just to sort of give you, this is one thing we didn't look at here in this demo. If I go back to this demo, and here we've got this div XYZ, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say, bar equals, and I'm going to say $sign H1 bar. Now, I haven't done anything with this bar element here. But now what I'm going to do with this bar element, I'm going to take this bar element and I'm going to grab my foos and I'm going to append to it my bar. What did that do here? Well, here's my foo, which is a div, and I've appended to it my bar. If I ended up going in and I went to inspect this, I would see that I have my div of class foo, and underneath that div, kind of hard to see here, I've got my H1 of bar. So, the point is that you use your $sign sometimes to create elements and use your $sign to select elements, and a lot of times you end up using them for both. So, there's an example of using the $sign for create and casting as well. So very often if you want to turn a DOM element into a jQuery object that you could manipulate, you could end up doing that. In the second example, there's the native DOM method of getElementById. If you end up wrapping that in a $sign, then you have a jQuery collection. If you, the last one's kind of a silly example, but if you have a jQuery collection and you wrap it in another $sign, nothing really changes. It still is just a jQuery collection. But again, casting ends up getting used where you have DOM elements and you want to add more functionality to them, which you can do with jQuery, and you have it as a DOM element, you could end up just wrapping it in the $sign. So another example here is that if we look at this example, and here's our jukeboxes and here's our button, we can end up wiring up each of our buttons on our jukebox. But the thing is that what happens if we decide to add more buttons? Well, if we ended up just wiring up our buttons, each of our buttons was wired up, and we decided to add 2 more songs here, they would not end up being wired up because you can't really go backwards. You found your buttons. This was, again, a wrapped set of 3 buttons, which were wired up, and now we add 2 more buttons. It's not like it's going to go back and rerun this. Well, how can we solve that problem? Well, jQuery does something kind of interesting. It gives us the ability to actually add a click handler to the parent element. And you can pass a second parameter to specify that I want to set up a click handler on Jukebox, but I want to be more specific. I want it to be for any button inside of Jukebox. And what that gives you the ability to do is that even when things end up getting dynamically added to the DOM, you have the ability to wire them up. And that becomes a feature that's pretty important. You'll end up using it within the workshop. So just to sort of give you a recap, right, jQuery is a client-side JavaScript library. You're going to be using it for selection, event handling, managing properties. In essence, you're going to be using it for manipulating the DOM. Still, jQuery is a little bit dated, and in fact, some of the other libraries that you end up working with, like Angular or React or some of the other client-side libraries that are out there, um, they don't. I think initially some of them use jQuery, but now they actually don't use jQuery at all. But it still has a big slot in the industry, and a lot of times, if you're doing something simplistically and you want to create some sort of simple client-side UI, jQuery could be a better bet than going into something that's could be a lot heavier, something like Angular or React. And again, the bigger thing is that you're not always working on brand new software. You're working on things that have been around there. So this is something that you know you will probably end up looking at in the course of your development, and we are going to end up looking at it in our next workshop.